ممتاز.
Okay.
أستاذ نبدأ.
We are going to start in a few seconds.
مساء الخير عليكم جميعا.
Good evening, everyone, and we welcome you to the Transitional Justice Ambassadors Forum in a new forum organized by SAM Organization for Rights and Liberties and Abductees Mother Association and DT Institute from Yemen to Chile. It's a study of the Chilean experience of the transition justice, and we'll try to benefit from it in Yemen. Today, we have a very important moment in Yemen, since we have many questions about transitional justice, reparations, and the collective memory. After a long time of war and division, we need to have more recommendations for the transitional justice so we can get the rights for the victims. Now, we need to benefit from the experiences of these countries, like Chile, that has changed from a dictatorship into a very important model for reconciliation and building the memory. We'll try to understand how Chile has successfully managed to change its situation and how we can benefit from this experience. What are the tools and the measures so we can enhance the peace and we build the peace? Today, we have a number of experienced experts from Yemen and international experts that can address the transition justice so we can have a good approach. Today, we're going to talk about three approaches. With Adel Sheila, he's going to talk about the study about the transition justice and the Chilean experience. As the second one, we are going to have Luciana Garcia. He is going to talk about the transition justice and the collective memory approaches and how to build the memory. The third one is going to be Ruben Carnaza. He is going to talk about the transitional justice and its role in the stability of the states. I'd like to draw your attention that we'll have discussions at the end of the webinar. And I'm very happy today to introduce Amat Salam Al-Haj, that she is the head of the Abductees Mothers Association. She's going to deliver a word. Thank you very much. In the beginning, I'd like to say good evening for everyone. We'd like to welcome everyone in his capacity and name to attend such an interactive webinar to build and also to have a deep peace building in Yemen. Then we are going to have a good social cohesion in Yemen, and we are going to understand the tools of the transitional justice and the outcomes if we applied it. We will end the conflict in Yemen, and we are going to build peace in Yemen, because history is very important and we can learn from different approaches practiced by different countries that were subject to war. The Chilean experience is very important. We need to have a constructive learning process and to profit in our Yemen situation. In our Transitional Justice Ambassadors Forum, which is a very important forum, that is a national forum that is independent also at the same time. It contains all the victims and the experts and the policy makers, through which we are trying to pave the way for stability in Yemen that is built on justice and redress. And we have different members in this forum. We have more than 240 members. They are going to work together to raise the awareness of the society and to understand transitional justice in a good way, and to also have a good way to pave the way for transitional justice. I think her voice has disappeared. I'm sorry. Her voice has disappeared. Amat Salam, are you still there? Amat Salam, are you still there? Our brothers and sisters in the committee, I think her internet is very weak. I believe she's not with us. She has a technical problem. Can we start with the first area? Let's start with the video. We have a video, short one.
الكل يسمعنا احنا يسمع.
Can you hear us, all of you?
أعتقد أنا أسمعك.
اوكي.
Yes, I can hear you.
دراسة لسام تستكشف العدالة الانتقالية بين دروس تشيلي وآفاق اليمن.
الدراسة ضمن مشروع سبارك الممول من معهد دي تي.
تشير الدراسة إلى أن العدالة الانتقالية تمثل المدخل الحقيقي لبناء سلام عادل في اليمن، وتوضح أن سنوات الحرب خلفت ضحايا بلا إنصاف ومجتمعا مثقلا بالانتهاكات دون مساءلة أو جبر للضرر. تؤكد أن غياب العدالة عزز ثقافة الإفلات من العقاب وكرس الانقسام وأضعف ثقة اليمنيين بالمؤسسات الرسمية. تبرز الدراسة أن معالجة آثار الحرب تبدأ من الحقيقة لا من الصفقات السياسية أو التسويات الهشة. تشدد على أن الضحية يجب أن تكون محور العملية وأن الاعتراف هو الخطوة الأولى نحو المصالحة. تستعرض الدراسة تجربة تشيلي بعد الدكتاتورية كنموذج ناجح للعدالة المتدرجة القائمة على كشف الحقيقة والمساءلة الهادئة. تؤكد الدراسة أن التوثيق المنهجي في تشيلي شكل الأساس للمحاسبة وأعاد الثقة بين الدولة والمجتمع. تربط الدراسة هذه التجربة بواقع اليمن، مؤكدة ضرورة تكييف الدروس مع خصوصية الصراع اليمني. تقترح الدراسة إنشاء منظومة وطنية موحدة للتوثيق تجمع الأدلة والشهادات ضمن أرشيف آمن ومحايد، وتدعو إلى برنامج شامل لجبر الضرر يضمن الرعاية النفسية والاجتماعية والاعتراف الرسمي بالضحايا. كما تؤكد أهمية مشروع ذاكرة وطنية يوثق الانتهاكات ويحول الألم إلى وعي جماعي يمنع التكرار. تخلص الدراسة إلى أن السلام الحقيقي يبدأ من العدالة، وأن الحقيقة هي الطريق الوحيد إلى المصالحة الدائمة.
كما أشار هذا التقرير أنه رغم
As mentioned in this report that although Yemen has passed through a lot of pains and complexities, transition justice will be the first path or the first step into real transitional justice. And now we are going to start with one of the experts from Yemen, Dr. Adel Deshila. He is a scholar and researcher. He has a PhD in English literature, and he is specialized in the literature of prisons or political prisons. He is studying and he is leading research about transitional justice in Yemen from the social society or aspect. Dr. Adel, in your study, when you try to link the Chilean experience with Yemen, you asked the question, can we implement transitional justice while the conflict is still ongoing and we still have political fragmentation? Let's hear what you say.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much.
صوتي مسموع.
Can you hear my voice? Yes, we can hear it. First of all, before I start talking, I'd like to thank the organizers and the associations and organizations that established this process or this project. When we talk about transitional justice, usually think about we have a phobia. There is a phobia of justice in Yemen for more than 50 years. We try to forget about the victims and we think about only the perpetrators, and we think about the political, and we didn't try to deal with the root causes of the political problems since the 60s until the 70s and the 80s of the last century until today. We have tried to have reconciliation, justice in Yemen, but it was to give immunity to the late President Ali Abdullah Saleh and his regime. I believe it wasn't the mistake in the political immunity that we give, but our mistake was how it was abused. Many countries have been through this problem, even in Chile. This started with the transitional justice. In the beginning, they didn't have any trials or tribunals. They tried, to negotiate between the dictatorship and the opposition. Then they got a formula to have election and to have transition. But after that, Chile has started to apply transitional justice. I will talk about it very fast. Now, we are in Yemen. If we try to implement transitional justice, we need to understand that in Yemen, we still live, we don't have a state. We don't have a state. We have many political parties in Yemen, and the conflict in Yemen is different from other conflicts in other countries like in Latin America. Usually it's between the state and opposition. But in Yemen, the problem is between militias and also the legitimate government. Even among the legitimate government, we have different attitudes and opinions. And everyone is trying not to talk about the truth. And everyone is trying not to compensate the victims and the survivors. So, the question that we can ask, can Yemen, or does Yemen need a transition justice according to the international standards, or we can have our own understanding of the transitional justice? So we can give it any term that will be in line with the situation in Yemen. So the problem is not with the term itself. The problem is that those political parties to the conflict have committed a lot of crimes against the Yemeni people, and they are trying now to shun away from the reparations, and they are trying to try to forgive. It's there in all the religions. In this role also, they tried, to forget about the past. Yeah, let's bury the hatches. But to forget the past without solving it, it opens new horizons for future conflicts. So in Yemen, we didn't try to redress the issues in Yemen. Then the victim has become a perpetrator, and the perpetrator has become a victim again. So in Yemen, do we need to start with from 1994, before it or after it, before 2011 or after 2011 or 2014? So these issues, we need to have a political understanding or political solution. I believe that the political powers in Yemen and the parties to the conflict are not ready to have any kind of negotiations to have transition justice. So in the end, we'll have a national reconciliation. They are trying their best to connect the reconciliation, to link between transition justice with the social justice. I don't understand the meaning of social justice in the Yemeni context. But there are nowadays we have civil society organizations. Why did I start with the Chilean experience? Although it's so difficult to apply it in Yemen to the letters, but I'd like to focus on one point here, which is very important and significant in Chile. And they tried in Chile to work together between the Catholic Church and the political opponents or oppositions and the civil society in Chile. We believe that in Latin America, usually they are they are Catholics,
احترام للكنيسة.
and they respect the church. So the connection and collaboration between the church and civil societies and the other different churches, they try to make a coalition. So the civil society organizations worked under this coalition. So the victims usually run away and they try to get protection from the church. Then they try to have their own committees and commissions, and these commissions are composed of members from the church and experts. They try to write down every minor details about the crimes. They document all the crimes for 17 years. For 17 years, from 1973 until 1990. After they have created this archive, this well-documented archive, when they had their reconciliation committee in RITIC, they depend on 70% on the archive. They went back to this archive when they tried to deal with the abuses and the violations. So the civil society tried to document for 70% of all the cases for almost 17 years. This is an example we can benefit from. We in Yemen, I focus on this point. I'm very also scared because we have civil society organizations, but we don't want these organizations to be biased. We wanted to have neutral and to forget about its ideological and to focus only on the victims and the survivors. Unfortunately, we're afraid that the civil society organizations in Yemen will be politicized and will not be neutral. The second one, we still have a gap between the civil society organizations and the masjid. Everyone thinks that cannot add or contribute to this issue. There should be a kind of collaboration between the masjid and also the tribal communities and also civil society organizations. There should be a real partnership between these institutions, regardless of their ideological and political ideology. If they can work together, this civil society work together, and they can document, like, for example, Yemen Observer and other organizations can document, but still, until now, they are numbers. We don't want the victim to be a number only. And the numbers are contradictory in these institutions. We need stories, we need events and places so we can benefit in the future. And also to locate, identify the places of crimes. There are hundreds of memory centers. I visited most of them in the Chilean capital. I went to the stadium. The basement of the stadium, it was a prisoner or detention center. So on its door or its gate, it was, there is no future without a past, something like this. I am trying, to remember from my memory as I understand it. Also, when the torture centers, it became or changed into memorial centers. They had roses and names. When you go there and visit these places, you can understand what happened in the past, so the generations will not forget what happened in the past, and they're not going to repeat. Chile was successful in making a program for the reparations for the victims. More than 600,000 people benefited from this program so far, according to the official reports. To change these torture centers into memorial centers and the gradual application of transitional justice. Civil society in Chile and the the left powers that led the country there, when they have the left wing controlled or ruled, they made the pressure to create or to implement the transitional justice, and they tried to benefit from the archive built by the civil society organizations. So Chile gradually applied the transitional justice. Then they started to have tribunals in 1998 when the Benouchi was detained in a clinic in London. Then after that, they started to have a kind of tribunals and trials for more than 100 figures from the authority and those who committed human rights violations. More than 800 people were in the court, and also they revealed the truth to the people, and they also tried to make reparations. They are trying to have reparations programs and also to reveal the truth and to stand by the victims. They said they didn't assassinate. He was arrested in London, and they tried to make a pressure because this is a national security issue. Then he returned to Chile, and he died in his country, but he didn't go to prison. But he was tried, and also other military personnel were tried in court. So far, Chile is one of the international exemplary experiences that we can benefit from. In Yemen, we need to have justice, and the justice needs to have the truth to be revealed. Also, after we reveal the truth, we need to have reparations, and we have institutions, and the institutions need to have a state. What we have nowadays in our hands is the civil society organizations should be active and engage actively with the political powers to adopt transitional justice in any reconciliation or political agreement in the future. Because if we have political agreement in the future and they tried not to deal with the human rights abuses in the past, it means that we'll have a problem in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was talking and the mic was not on. You talked about civil society and how they can focus on the victims and the survivors, and they need to deal with them as stories, not as numbers. There is a gap between the civil society and the religious institutions, like you said, the masjid, and there is a kind of phobia that these civil society organizations will be politicized and will not be biased. And so we cannot have good outcomes. So we need also to understand the reparations and how Yemen needs to have justice, and also to reveal the truth, and also to have reparations and to have state institutions. Dr. Adel, why do you think the victims should be at the center? How this will help us to have a political settlement, which is going to be short term? When we talk about the victims' cases, we have, for example, Tahama case. Nobody focuses on it. Have you heard about it in the past? It was talked about in the National Conference dialogue, when they also talked about those people who were dismissed from their jobs. These are victims. We still also have victims from the 80s. Also, There are violations that took place, and we know the perpetrators all. When they sit at the negotiation table, we know that we have regional powers in the Yemeni conflict. It will, I'm sorry, it will make one party to win at the expenses of the victims. It was in 1973 until 2011 until today. So the political powers in Yemen, when they come to the negotiation table, it's usually forced to go because of the regional powers, or they cannot continue fight. So that's why they come to the negotiation table and they sign the political agreement. So they are going to reshuffle their papers, and they are going to create a new conflict. If we can understand and solve the problem of the victim in the future, it will not be a perpetrator in the future. Today, you opened a new corner for us to understand, think about transitional justice and what it means to the people before the state. Justice is not in the laws, but in the collective awareness of the people. We need also to understand. Thank you very much, Dr. Adel, for your presentation, that you focus on the victims. If your study today has led for us some light. So we have now the second partner. Our speaker is going in Chile. The pain in Chile has become now a new horizon for us to understand. Now we'll go to Chile, to a house that was the house of pain, and today it's a memory house. He's the head of the memorial house in Chile, and he's an experience in the memorial and experiences, and he is also a human rights expert. He's going to talk to us about the Chile experience and also the symbolic centers that change from torture centers into how did you change how can you benefit from the memorial, and how can we benefit if Yemen wants to apply the same.
أستاذ لوتسيانو.
Mr. Luciano or Luciano, you're muted. You are muted. We will have translation.
أستاذ توفيق معنا أنت؟
Mr. نعم معك. Are you with us?
نعم معك. It is my turn now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. It is an honor to me to be here in this webinar, invited to present a synthetic overview of the Chilean experience in transitional justice and of the José Domingo Caño's House of Memory, a site of conscience that preserves the truth, promotion, reparation, and works for guarantees of non-repetition. The Chilean experience provides practical lessons on public investigations, judicial processes, reparation measures, and collective memory strategies that can be valuable for scholars and civil society organizations in Yemen. We hope that this analysis will facilitate the exchange of experiences, the construction of transitional networks, and the design of local policies with cultural and gender sensitivity. The presentation is structured under the dimensions of transitional justice given by the United Nations High Commissioners of Human Rights and ends with a brief presentation of our City of Memory. A widely cited definition of transitional justice, found in several publications by the United Nations and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, describes it as the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempt to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past violations and abuses. in order to ensure accountability, deliver justice, and achieve reconciliation. This process has been articulated around 5 fundamental pillars: truth, justice, reparation, guarantees of non-recurrence, and memory. Each of them represents a depth, a struggle, and a hope. This is the definition of truth for transitional processes according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The focus is on the fact that the right to truth is inalienable. The victims, their families, and society have the right to know what happened, who ordered it, how the machinery of state terrorism operated in order to prevent the recurrence of such acts. In Chile, in the months following the change of command between the dictator Pinochet and the newly elected president, the first Truth Commission was convened to investigate only cases of forced disappearance and executions for political reasons. These commissions were initiated after the annihilation of groups that resisted the dictatorship with arms and the ideological defeat of socialist ideas after the fall of the wall in Berlin, Germany in 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1980. The information collected by this commission is available to the prosecutor's office and available to cases of human rights violations. 14 years later, after Pinochet's arrest and an unsuccessful dialogue table, 2 new truth commissions are convened in 2004 and 2010 to investigate cases of political imprisonment, torture, as well as cases of forced disappearance and political executions. The information collected by these latter commissions remains secret for 50 years, despite the claims of survivors, relatives, and organizations. More recently, in 2022, a search plan for forced disappearances was established. To date, it has been able to systemize the number of victims of forced disappearance, partially establish the trajectories of their kidnapping, but has not yet been able to find new remains. These truth commissions do not cover cases of political exile, massive raids, relegation, sales of state companies, or corruption. In the case of Chile, the truth commissions have been important steps, but the 50-year secrecy about their archives still persists. The National Search Plan initiated in 2022 represents progress, but it also shows the state's delay in assuming its responsibility. This is the definition of justice for transitional processes according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where the focus is on the right of victims to access to justice and the responsibility to ensure that perpetrators of crimes are investigated, tried, and duly punished. This graph shows the main international legal milestones that have influenced the construction of transitional justice and human rights framework in Chile. The chronology highlights how the country has been progressively linked to international standards. This timeline also gives us an account of the legal instruments available at the moment of the crimes carried out during the dictatorship. We're talking about the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg in 1945-1946, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention Against Genocide, the Convention Against Rules to Limit Barbarism and Armed Conflicts, the Covenant in Civil and Political Rights of 1966. Another attention is given to the arrest in 1998 of Pinochet in the city of London, with the application of universal justice in the case of crimes against humanity and genocide. But what do we mean when we talk about crimes against humanity? We are talking about humanity injured, humanity damaged. They are widespread or systematic attacks against the civilian population, and these attacks respond to a policy of the state and or its agents under the direction of a responsible command who exercise such control over the territory that has followed them to carry out military operations, and that they hold a de facto power that favors impunity for their acts. Given their gravity, these crimes are non-amnestiable and are imprescriptible. Therefore, states have the obligations to persecute the perpetrators with the application of universal justice, either in their own states, if they enter their jurisdiction regardless of their nationality, or under the international criminal courts when states cannot or do not want to persecute them. In the case of Chile, the application of justice has gone through various stages during the dictatorial period. Total impunity, all cases are passed to military courts. Over the next decade, most cases were subject to the 1978 amnesty law, with very few exceptions. Only after the conviction of Chile by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights did there be progress in the convictions of perpetrators, but with strict prescription measures. This year, Chile was condemned by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in this matter, and its implications remain to be seen. Here, we can also see how civil society supported the documentation and representation of cases from the moment that have occurred to the present. In the case of Chile, justice has been elusive. The amnesty decree law of 1978 is still in force. Most perpetrators do not serve effective sentences. Civil society has been the driving force behind the lawsuits, while the state has defended those responsible, even financing their defense. An example of the statute of limitations is the Parral episode. A person was convicted by the Supreme Court as the perpetrator of the aggravated kidnapping, enforced disappearance, of 27 people, including a child, to a sentence of 5 years after reducing it as a result of the application of gradual prescription measures. We are talking about 27 people who were disappeared and only 5-year sentence. It is said that justice that takes time is not justice, and this graph shows how the delay in the application of justice in Chile has been. On one hand, the numbers of crimes according to the year of the event are shown in red, and in blue, the number of victims who obtain a sentence in their favor in the Supreme Court. 84% of the crimes were committed during the first 3 years of the dictatorship. In those years, families, civil and church organizations filed the first judicial appeals. The average duration of these cases is 45 years. Justice delayed is justice denied. This is the definition of the guarantees of reparation in transitional processes according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where the focus is on victims, their families and communities, providing restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction. The idea is to heal the wound in the most comprehensive way possible. In Chile, the reparation measures have been recommended by the various truth commissions that the Chilean transitional process has had. Their implementation has been fragmented, insufficient, and exclusive, and pushed by the mobilizations of former political prisoners and civil organizations. The Retic, Village, and political exoneree pensions do not cover all forms of damage. The restitution of property has been partial and without a public cadastre. The dates of commemorations have no national relevance. We insist that reparation must be comprehensive. We have been hijacked and put a sign of the swastika in the presentation. Do you see that? Adele, please help here. Hala?
Yeah, I see it.
تفضل يا أستاذ.
I
خلص
think you should check the participants list.
تبعه.
Excuse me, did you finish your
We are not-
presentation?
بس لو سمحتوا من فريق سام إذا حدا بس يطالع الشخص الغريب اللي موجود.
They are going to remove the hijacker or the hacker.
I will not share the stop share, and I will share again the presentation. Can you see the presentation now?
نعم نعم.
Okay, I will continue. We insist that reparation must be comprehensive, restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction. But it must also be symbolic, such as public recognition and a commitment to non-recurrence. This is the definition of guarantees of non-recurrence of transitional processes according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where the focus is on the prevention of future human rights violation and the strengthening of the rule of law through institutional reforms, social interventions, and cultural reforms. This graph represents a timeline with key milestones in the development of policies, institutions, and social mobilizations linked to human rights in Chile. It covers 3 decades of legislative, institutional, and social advances. 1990, the signs of international treaties, 2009, creation of national human rights institution, and so on. This journey shows a growing institutionalization of human rights with normative advances as a response to social demands. Guarantees of non-recurrences are essential to prevent the harm from repeating itself. However, in Chile, the armed and security forces are still formed under the logic of the internal enemy. There has been no purge of agents involved in violations. Human rights training is scarce in the formal education. Institutional, social, and cultural reforms are urgent and must be sustained over time. This graph shows the timeline of institutional reforms around this pillar and highlights 2 moments, in 2011 and in 2019, when there were vast protest movements due to conditions of social inequality, and the state response, in both cases, very similar. Thousands of people arrested, hundreds of victims with eye mutilations, more than 10,000 complaints of institutional violence, including torture and sexual violence. Recently, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has incorporated memory as the last pillar of the transitional processes, as a pillar that incorporates the rest of them as an ethical and political duty. In Chile, this component has not been a public policy. All spaces of memory have been promoted and sustained by civil society. Gradually, the state has been recognizing sites of memory as places that it must be protected. However, it has not yet implemented a specific law on sites of memory, nor a sustainable financing mechanism. Each and every one of these sites of memory have obtained this declaration of protection due to pressure from neighbors, relatives of victims organizations, in short, civil society organizations. But there's a trick. Only 7 of these 60 sites of memory have a permanent state fund. All others must apply for competitive funds that do not reach more than 15 sites for the payment of bills and minimum personnel. Here we highlight our site of memory, the second to have the legal protection of a historical site after 12 years since the return to democracy. The site of memory of José Domingo Cañas has an evolution that we start in the late 60s, early 70s of the last century, when it was occupied as a center of political training, but with a coup d'etat, it was converted into an annex of the Panamanian embassy, managing to shelter and saving more than 300 people. In August 1974, it was converted into a barracks of the intelligence services and used as a center for kidnapping, torture, and extermination until 1987. Around 200 people passed through these barracks, 68 of them victims of forced disappearance. In 2002, it was declared a historic site after years of public advocacy by neighbors, students, and relatives of victims, and then getting a state entity to build the current site of memory inaugurated in 2010. Casa Memoria José Domingo Cañas is an example of resistance, resilience, and persistence. Memory is not just remembrance, it is action, it is prevention, it is reparation. More than 15 years ago, we opened the doors of the site to the community. Shortly after, in the midst of the student mobilizations, we created a commission of human rights observers that to date has carried out more than 300 observation missions, has written more than 20 human rights reports presented to national and international bodies. We received more than 5,000 visits to the site, and all with a minimum of state budget. To conclude, in Chile, transitional justice has advanced, but it has not fulfilled its promise. Denied truth persists. Justice that delays is not justice. Reparations that do not arrive are not comprehensive. Horrors that are repeated and memories that are forgotten. In few more weeks, in Chile, a new president of the Republic will be elected, and a large part of the Congress will be renewed. Polls predict that the political groups that identifies with authoritarianism and defends the dictatorial regime has a great chance of winning this election. If this happens, the few achievements made are in serious danger. Today, more than ever, we need an active commitment from the state, institutions, and society to make never again a reality. Because without truth, justice, reparation, guarantees, and memory, there's no full democracy. We hope that by sharing this experience, it will help our communities to move toward a society that respects human rights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, in which you focused about the rights and the victims and how to have reparations for the victims, and also how to gain and access truth between. You talked about how the Chilean worked in the state to implement or apply transitional justice, whether there was immunity for some figures or not, and the progress that you have made in prosecuting some people, and how the civil society can help the path of transitional justice. And also you give us the different definitions and how they can have their own interventions. The question is how the politicizing of civil society organizations and how in our country, for example, now we have different places of conflict in our country. From your own experience, how can we build the collective memory? How can we protect the Yemeni collective memory from being politicized by civil society organizations? and different parties to the conflict, how we can have initiatives, cultural initiatives also, to work together instead of the state institutions. Hello, can you hear me, sir? Hello, can you hear me, sir?
ننتقل للمحور الثالث. طيب بعدين في نهاية
شو اللي بعد؟
Okay.
من ضمن هذا السؤال إن شاء الله.
Okay, now we'll go to the third keynote speaker. Thank you very much for Dr. Luciano. Yemen is like Chile. We need to have a memory to build it from the truth commissions. How can we build this memory? How it can become policies and reform institutions. Now Mr. Ruben is going to talk about it. He is an expert in the ICTJ in New York, and also he is the head of the operation program. And this, he's going to talk about the transition justice for the stability of the countries, how it can be implemented in Yemen. Mr. Ruben, we'd like to welcome you in this forum. How can Yemen benefit from the transitional justice? And while we have a lot of different political parties and different parties to the conflict, what is the most important or the primary step that can be adopted by Yemeni organizations to implement transitional justice in the future?
Shukran.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me stop my translation.
We're glad to be speaking with Yemeni colleagues working on transitional justice, and thank you for having me. Earlier, my colleague in ICTJ, Noor El-Bejani, who heads our work in Yemen, was around, but she had to leave for another meeting. But she will be happy, of course, to share this discussion once it's recorded and available for sharing. ICTJ has worked in Yemen for many years, soon after the revolution. But of course, it has become very difficult, as you, of course, know, to continue working in Yemen. But we have decided that we will try our best to at least watch what is happening and, if necessary, participate in discussions like this. I'll say a few words about the topic that you asked me to talk about. It's a difficult topic because it asks for the role of transitional justice in promoting security and stability in states and societies. And the first challenge, of course, is to ask whether it is transitional justice that helps promote security and stability, or is it security and stability that promotes transitional justice? That's an important question because it challenges all of us to think about the limits of transitional justice as well as its potential. One way to answer my own question is to point out that transitions, not necessarily transitional justice, but transitions, can happen when a society is unstable and when the security of the state is challenged. This is important because we often think of instability as a problem. We often think of insecurity as a difficulty, but we also know that when there is political instability, when the state is facing security challenges, there is a potential for change. There is a potential for transitions to happen. That does not mean that transitional justice will then follow from the transition. We are seeing this now, for example, in Sudan, where you had a transition from dictatorship because of the revolution, and now there is armed conflict. And of course, Yemen knows very well the difficulty of a transition where transitional justice was pursued but has been derailed by armed conflict. In the photo in this slide, you can see also one important phenomenon that for those of us working in transitional justice is important to take into account. There are protests that have been happening across the world, and what is an important feature of these protests is that they are being led by a new generation of activists. Activists much younger than us, activists who sometimes have the same grievances, for example, that were aired during the Arab Spring. But for many of them, I think some of the grievances are new, are different, might even be strange to us who are older than them. So we have seen this happen recently in Madagascar. We have seen this happen in Morocco. And I think one of your Yemeni colleagues was criticized by Moroccans for pointing out the Gen Z revolution that was happening in Morocco. You've seen what happened in Nepal, where the parliament was burnt down by young protesters. ICTJ worked in Nepal for many years. I worked in Nepal for many years. And it asks the question, is transitional justice relevant to these situations? In Nepal, after the armed conflict between 1996 to 2006, a truth commission was created. A commission on enforced disappearances was created. An interim reparations program was established. And yet, you have these protests. You have protests that have escalated so much that they overthrew a government. So it's important to ask the question whether transitional justice is relevant in the kind of uprisings that we're now seeing. It's also important for us to ask, when you want to talk about the role of transitional justice in stability and security, to look at your own experience. What happened after the Arab Spring revolutions in the region? Did it lead to stability? Did it lead to security? Or did it lead to something else? It's tempting to say that in some of the countries where transitional justice was attempted in the region, that the attempts at transitional justice did not succeed, but I think it is more complicated than that. Transitional justice only gives an opportunity for accountability, an opportunity for truth-seeking, an opportunity for reparations, but it does not necessarily and by itself promote security, promote stability. The period of the transition is one of the most unstable and is one of the most insecure periods in the country's history. And I think the challenges of timing and sequencing transitional justice processes so that you don't push too hard and too far, but you don't also act too slow. And as Luciano pointed out, you delay justice, you delay accountability, and in the end, weaken society, allow it to be unstable, allow it to be insecure. The other relevant question to ask is whether international human rights law and humanitarian law are still relevant today. And I forgot to add the last part of that bullet point on this slide about genocide. When genocide is happening, what does that say about the success or failure of transitional justice, not just in the country where it's happening, not just in Gaza, not just in Palestine, but in countries where transitional justice was supposed to have inaugurated a new society, a new state. So it's important to ask whether transitional justice itself needs to change, whether it needs to adapt to conditions where human rights law and international humanitarian law have been weakened by states that don't respect them, have been rendered irrelevant by countries that commit genocide or enable genocide to happen. And here is an important quote that I think is worth remembering. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist who helped establish the Italian Communist Party in between World War I and World War II, was imprisoned and died in prison. And this is one of the more important quotes from him. The old world is dying, and the new struggles to be born. And so now is the time of monsters. And he says this because when he said this, World War I had just ended. World War II was going to happen a few years later. And in that period, fascism was born in Italy. Later on, Nazi Germany emerged. And of course, you had a fascist dictatorship in Spain. And it was difficult for people like Antonio Gramsci to push back against the monsters that were emerging. And I would say we are in that situation today. We are in a world where the old is dying. International human rights law and humanitarian law are too weak to prevent the kind of atrocities we are seeing. But the new world still struggles to be born. Change is possible, but it has not happened yet. You see young people protest, Gen Z revolutions taking place, but we don't know what the outcome of that will be. So I'll skip. Well, this is a slide that just summarizes the circumstances we are in. There is economic and social inequality. There is technological inequality, access to the internet, access to AI, for example, the use of drones for war instead of using drones for peace. You have authoritarian leaders emerging and exploiting that inequality. You have corporations that are more powerful than governments. You have corruption and economic grievances, again, driving protests, just as we saw in the Arab Spring. And you have peace processes that cannot keep up with the escalation of armed conflict. And of course, as a result, you have migration and displacement, not just because of war, but also because of climate change. So when we talk about transitional justice then, it's important to distinguish that from justice. Transitional justice consists of processes, and as Luciano was able to explain very thoroughly, you have transitional justice processes such as criminal prosecutions, reparations, truth commissions, institutional reforms, but in themselves, they are just tools. They don't guarantee justice. They don't mean that when you establish a truth commission, you will have truth, or that when you try to prosecute perpetrators of human rights violations, there will be accountability. Justice is different because it's an outcome, and in some ways, it's not always going to be satisfactory, but it is something that is incremental, that will be built upon. So even those attempts in Yemen at transitional justice are important because you build upon them. You don't look back and say, we failed. You look back and say, what do we learn from that? So an example of transitional justice that isn't really transitional justice is Libya, where ICTJ works and where I also have done work. In Libya, you have victor's justice disguised as transitional justice. And this is an example of the work that we tried to do, but were limited by the situation in Libya. Misrata, a city in Libya that was seen as a center of opposition to Gaddafi, was involved in the armed conflict against Gaddafi. But next to Misrata is the community of Tawerga, whose people are perceived to be loyal to Gaddafi, which is an unfair perception because Many Tawergans did not fight for one side or the other, but some of them were in the army of the Libyan state under Gaddafi. So there was conflict between Misrata and Tawerga, but at the end of the conflict, when Gaddafi was overthrown, many Misratans were displaced. Many Misratans were forced out of their homes and up to today live in displacement camps outside of their community. And yet, the agreement between Misrata and Tawerga, the leaders of the two communities that was brokered by the United Nations, is being sold as an example of reconciliation. Misratans obtained compensation, but Tawergans who asked for the right to return to their homes were denied that right. So up to today, you have one city that won during the conflict, enjoying reparations, but the other community, perceived as the losing community, still cannot return home. That is not transitional justice, and that is not reconciliation. So important to ask when talking about stability and security is to ask, what do we mean by a stable society? A stable society isn't merely about holding elections among political elites. It is not only about reconciliation between rival armed groups that we might see in Libya or we might even see in Yemen, but it requires respect for the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of the marginalized and those who organize them, labor unions, youth groups, women, indigenous people, the disabled, and the displaced. ICTJ published this report recently, led by my colleague Noor El-Beljani, and it's an important report because, among others, we point out that for transitional justice to happen in a country, those who advocate transitional justice must be allowed to do their advocacy. Restrictions must be lifted on repressing these civil society groups and the NGOs that work on them. Stability and security also has to be seen in terms of who commits instability, who is behind insecurity. Instability can come from the political elite fighting for power. Instability can also be because people demand the fulfillment of their social, economic, and cultural rights. Some transitional justice approaches have sought stability by resolving elite conflict. An example of this is Tunisia, where right after the revolution, during the transitional period, there were political assassinations of secular and left-wing leaders by alleged Islamist assassins. And this created tension between the political parties. Of course, also their supporters. In Tunisia, the heads of the labor union, the head of the business association, the head of a human rights group, and the head of the lawyers association worked together to try to resolve this conflict. They won a Nobel Prize for that, but until that was, this was still an elite process, and so not necessarily leading to transitional justice. I'll finish so that you can ask questions, and I'll skip some slides. I'll wind up. Transitional justice can help stabilize societies by promoting political pluralism and examining economic roots of conflict. So truth-seeking must always examine colonial history and its implications in the present. Prosecution must not be privileged over other forms of transitional justice. Reparations and the needs of victims should be prioritized. Grievances over land and natural resources are transitional justice issues, and they require immediate attention and long-term investment. And institutional reforms in transitional justice must go beyond the military, the police, or courts. They must include economic and social institutions. It's also important to build a stable and secure society by confronting the past and even revolutionizing transitional justice. And you can see that protests in Yemen included Tawakkol Karman's photo alongside Che Guevara, and perhaps it's a reminder of how radical the protests were and the potential for a revolutionary transitional justice that you had in Yemen. So I'll close with this quotation from Tawakkol Karman. I want a future where my children feel safe and appreciated and proud to be who they are. My heart is one with all the Arab Spring heroes, no matter how small they think their role is. We are working for a world where we can live with others in a dignified way. And that's, I think, the Arabic version. I asked Noor to translate that. I'm not sure if this was correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You talked about the role of the transition justice and stability and security, which is also a chance to enhance stability. And also you talked about the prestige, the demonstrations, and also the genocide that happened in many countries. Also about and also how they can access the internet and the artificial intelligence. And nowadays, you said also that corporations are bigger than some states, and how we can also advocate for social justice, and also to see and to focus on the perpetrators. There should be also institutional reforms, and there should be also economic. We have this question, Mr. Rubin, about the golden standard for reparation program in Yemen. How can we balance between the lack of resources to fund such programs? How can we make the reparation program a very effective tool? It's not only that we give money to some victims or survivors. I believe if we can give some small money, then we can also give moral, then we can also develop such programs so it can also be comprehensive to other regions.
Right, and I think there's a short answer to your question. Reparations cannot happen without resources and funding for reparations. And many global South developing countries are too poor to fund reparations directly. Some of the more important resources for reparations come from recovering assets of those who were behind human rights violations. The Saleh dictatorship, the dictator himself has assets, and I think recovering those assets would be helpful. But it is also just as important to look at who the perpetrators are, not just individual armed groups, but those who profit from them, not just those in Yemen, but those outside Yemen, those who are behind airstrikes, those who profit from the weapons that are sold and exported that are used in airstrikes. I'm glad that Luciano talked about Chile, because Chile's example is important.
This is what Yemen needs, really. Now we'll open the questions from our attendees. If anyone has a question, he can raise his hand so we can give the questions to our speakers.
أسئلة بالشات يمكن تقرأيها.
There are questions in the chat, you can read them. There is a question from Dr. Hiba. She said, the question is for Luciano. Mr. Luciano, this question, civil society organizations are politicized, but not all of them. We are talking about transitional justice. We should talk objectively. We started with the National Dialogue Conference It started also until 2015. How can we identify the politicized civil society organizations? And how can they participate in the transitional justice? I think the question is for Dr. Luciano.
I
Dr.
do not
Luciano?
understand the question.
I'll repeat the question for you. She is okay. She is talking about civil society organizations in Yemen. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Luciano, do you hear
Can
us?
you hear me? Can you hear the
No.
interpreter?
I do not understand what you are
أوكي، إذن
saying.
سننقل بالتساؤل للأستاذ الدكتور عادل دشيلة. هل
Now we'll ask
أن
Dr.
تفهم
Adel
هذا
Chela
التساؤل؟
if he can answer this question.
مؤسسات المجتمع المدني
What about the civil society politicized? There are some violations. It will be done by only one party. Is it possible to have civil society organizations, initiatives, or cultural initiatives instead of the transitional justice organizations? In fact, when we talk about civil society organizations, we don't say that they are politicized, but we are afraid that they are going to side with one party. We believe that civil society organizations, for example, which work in the area controlled by Al-Houthi, they cannot work. They cannot document all the violations without the observation of the militia. Yeah, there is a margin of space of space. Those, especially those who can work, like in Ta'az and in the middle or the center of the Yemen, also in Marib and Aden. But the question is, these organizations have the ability to create coalition, what happened in Chile, so they can have a vision how document the violations as much as possible, especially in the areas controlled by the Houthi or by the Yemeni legitimate government. If they can have alliances and they focus on the victims' stories, regardless of the victim's nature. A victim is a victim. In this case, they can become successful. They can have also database. We can depend on it in the future when we have transitional justice in Yemen after the conflict. The second point, the civil society organizations should have a vision how to deal with the political parties, because those who are presiding those social society organizations are members in some political parties. So unfortunately, they should have a clear vision how to deal with their political parties as much as possible. So there should be a kind of credibility, a kind of impartiality to stand by the truth. In this case, we can, and they work with these social institutions like the masjid and the tribes. I remember one of the ladies, I forgot her name, Ubaida or something. She was there and she tried to intimidate between the people. Those civil society organizations, whether they are women's civil society organizations, with the society itself, with the religious institutions like the masjid, they can have their own alliance coalition. They can cover for the victims in the future, so they can make pressure on the political or the conflict parties. Of course, this is what I mentioned about the have different stories. Each one is trying to write his own narratives. And here we have to protect the memory as a national collective effort, and also about and how we can avoid politicization of the civil organizations. So, Mr. Rubin, what are the tools that can be practical and effective in your organization to archive the Yemeni memory now? What can we do even before we have political settlement? And as you know, the situation in Yemen, it's very complicated, the situation in Yemen.
Well, I can give you two examples of
okay.
work we did that might be helpful for Yemen. Right now, we are working with Libyan organizations on a Libyan oral history archive. So these are interviews being done by Libyans of those who lived through different periods of Libyan history, including the colonial period. Some people are still alive. The Gaddafi period, those who were detained in Gaddafi's prisons, and even now during the armed conflict. They have put together an archive of audio, mostly oral history, and we are preserving that and then helping them organize an unofficial truth-seeking and truth-telling project. So unofficial because it is not part of the state of Libya's transitional justice effort. The other example is Afghanistan, where we used to work. There is a virtual museum of victims of Afghanistan's various wars since, not just during the Taliban period, but during the NATO invasion of Afghanistan and even before that. It's a virtual museum, but you can get case studies of different families affected by the conflict, as well as some of the cases that have been filed by those families in other countries. These are all digital, and I think it's important to convince donors who fund civil society groups in Yemen to fund these projects, because these are not just memory projects. These are documentation projects that will allow truth commissions in the future in Yemen, or prosecutions possibly in Yemen, or even reparations programs in Yemen to be implemented without too much work putting them together, especially if your truth commissions, your prosecutions, your reparations program only happen many years from now, when it's more difficult to get testimony, when it's more difficult to gather documentation. So now is the time to do that, and preserving them as not just as archives that will only be opened later, but as dynamic, continuing documentation efforts. That's going to be important. And by the way, I translated for Luciano the question earlier. Las CSOs politizadas serían buenas participares en la justicia transicional, Luciano. That was the question.
Okay. Yes, all the social...
Are you hearing us?
All the social organizations in Chile have one or some way levels of politicization. And the CODEPU organization was led by political organizations of MIR, of the movement of left, revolutionary left movement, the Vicaría de la Solidaridad, and others were much closer to the Socialist Party, Democratic Christian Party, and the Communist Party. And that is a reality of us. But the whole of them, the extent of organizations of social organizations, could document all or most of the crimes during the dictatorship. I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luciano. Thank you, Mr. Robbins. Thank you, Dr. Adel Deshela, for your presentation that was very important and very rich. The transitional justice is a very important concept in Yemen, and we need to shed light on it. And also, everyone, if there is any comment or question. Is there a question from those who are listening to us? Fawzi is asking a question. How can we...
اليد مرفوعة. شوف اليد المرفوعة أيضا.
You can see those who raise their hands. Those who raise their hands. Khalifa, you can start. Haifa. My name is Haifa. Of course, I'd like to thank all those who are present with us. First of all, when we talk about Yemen, when we talk about transition justice, is very important at this time, because for the future, now in Yemen, it's not stable. We don't have economy and we don't have any kind of stability. So when we talk about reparations and the other tools of reparations, it's very early. This is what I believe. When we talk about our situation, like for example, we have those Israeli fighter jets striking some places in Yemen. Do you think that those people who are subject to these strikes will be part of the victims? They lost their houses. Are they going to be part of the transitional justice? Are they going to be compensated? I respect the Chilean experience. The Chilean experience, it wasn't that successful. The tribunals were not real. They were only formal. Many of the perpetrators were not brought to court. And this is what happened also in Yemen. In the process of peace, a lot of people will try, to overlook some issues. How we can have transitional justice while we have all of these challenges. Mr. Adel, you can start. First of all, thank you very much for transition justice. Is a partial process. We cannot apply transitional justice as it is to the letter in any country. If you see or study the international experiences, there wasn't any kind of reparations like in South Africa, Rwanda. The people were slaughtered. The country didn't provide them reparations or financial compensation, so they had their own non-official courts. The Chilean experience is successful at the international stage. We can benefit from it. There is a movement, a civil movement that was very large that compelled the countries after the dictatorship regime collapsed to adopt reparations. Also, I mentioned that more than 600,000 people benefit from the reparation programs, health, psychologically and morally and financially. Many of the detention centers were transformed into memory centers. When you go to Chile and you see, and everywhere, this landmark is a national memory. This is a successful story or a success story. Yes, of course, it didn't succeed fully, but they made a lot of progress in Yemen. Now, we don't have institutions or judicial institutions that can demand the countries, the regional countries that were involved in the Yemeni conflict. And this is why I'm afraid that the regional powers that were perpetrating crimes against Yemenis, they will press the political parties and they will not be liable. When we talk about these regional powers, even including the Israeli air jet strikes, there can be a kind of Yemeni lawyers to be appointed and to give them all the cases, and they can have international litigation. We have international organizations and we have international tribunals. If we have a very good, well-documented cases, we can also lodge such files. If we cannot do it in our country, we can do it outside. There will be a kind of reparations for the victims. When we talk about it's early to talk about reparations. How can we to bring the conflict parties to the negotiation table? If you tell them, let's start with the tribunals or the courts. But if you say, who has any grievances, everyone will come and will say, I have a grievance, and so reparation can be part to establish and implement the transitional justice. You can accept all the parties. It's not possible to give money to all. We have our cultural backgrounds and we can use it. How can we have our own version of transitional justice? We can depend on our legacies of traditions, and we have a number of lawyers and judges and those people, human rights advocates. They can create a mechanism how to establish transitional justice in Yemen from a Yemeni perspective. We can change it. We can call it reconciliation. I know that people are afraid, are scared of the transitional justice. We can call it justice or reconciliation. We can benefit from our legacy of traditions and culture. We can create our own mechanisms to apply the transition justice. Transition justice needs 30 years. It can't happen overnight. Of course, doctor. This is what brings us back to the nature of the transitional justice. Reparation should be a path for the trust. It should not be a financial transaction. Societies cannot be cured with numbers. That we need to recognize their dignity. This is what Yemen needs first. Thank you very much. And we'd like to thank Dr. Adel and all those attendees to enrich our topic and our forum. The most important question that we leave you with, how we can convert the others' experience into our own experience, how we can have our own memory. Maybe transition justice is not a luxury thing for us, but it should include all the victims. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for those organizing parties. And also thank you for those who are with us. You are the transitional justice ambassadors.